that next morning, with the way they plan on going about crossing the Matanicow, is having the Marines of 2-5 and the 1st Raider Battalion make a feint attack, if you will, across the mouth of the river where they just attempted to cross, earlier that day. While they're making that feint, action across, not necessarily across, I guess feint action for Point Cruz, they do intend to cross the river, but they don't intend to go too far inland from the river, right? They want to get far enough to get a little foothold and keep the Japanese occupied.
Yeah.
At the same time, once they get across the river, the rest of Puller's companies from 1-7, so that'd be Alpha, Bravo, and Delta companies, would board Higgins boats, sail from Lunga Point, and then land on the western side of Point Cruz. And Point Cruz is this little peninsular land feature that is on the western, like the west bank, essentially, of the Matanicow River. They want them to make landfall near there and then basically cut off any Japanese forces on Point Cruz and attack whatever this defensive line is from the rear so that they can break through this defense and continue moving on towards Cochabona. Great plan in theory.
Yes.
But unfortunately, some things do go terribly wrong. So the next day, Puller's C Company and the 1st Raider Battalion, they wake up in the morning, they start attempting to cross the river. And very quickly, they get into a really terrible situation. The Japanese defenses are super strong. The way they're approaching has them like on this shelf, essentially pinned between, almost a sheer cliff and the water. So they're just it's a terrible place to try to make an advance. From what I've heard it described as and read it described as, it's one of the most effective bottlenecks that any of these guys had seen the Japanese use to their advantage. And on top of this, communications are performing poorly is a vast understatement. They're terrible at this time. And the reason that is there's this bombardment of Lunga Point, the defenses at Lunga Point happening, and it knocks out their comms tower. So the last word that Edson and Vandergrift both get, is that his raiders have made it across the river, when in fact they have not made it across the river. They're in the river trying to get across the river.
Oh boy.
And getting ready to pull back because things are just too intense. But getting that word, Vandergrift goes ahead and launches A, B, and D Company of 1-7 from Lunga Point on those Higgins boats. Higgins boats are the boats you see in Saving Private Ryan, where the front, they're an amphibious assault vehicle, and the front door comes down and they run, makes a ramp that they can run onto the beach on. So these guys start making their way around, out past the Matanicow River, out to sea, past the Matanicow River, around Point Cruz to make landfall on that western side of the peninsula there. And they make landfall, everybody gets on the beach fine, and they move about 350 yards inland to a bare knoll, a ridge line that's barren, essentially. And again, these are coral mountains. That's why there's no vegetation growing on them, really. Most of the mountains you see on Guadalcanal are barren. But anyways, they take up position there. It's called Hill 84. Unfortunately for them, Japanese reinforcements were already on their way down that direction because of the fighting taking place at the mouth of the Matanicow. So when these American troops land, they get hit from their west by that unit coming down the road there to occupy Point Cruz and all that stuff, and they get hit from their east from Japanese troops on that side of them as well. So right off the bat, they're pretty much surrounded and cut off.
Well, another problem with these coral ridges and mountains and stuff, you're not digging in on that either.
So you're not digging in. You're right.
Kind of out in the open
right
at that point.
Right. And it just super exposed. And to make matters worse, there's a few things that happen that really just are icing on the cake for this. But the acting battalion commander, his name is Major Ortho Rogers, is killed almost immediately in the opening bursts. So command and control out the window. I mean, at least at that level, the guys take the job. I'm not saying people don't step up to take the job, but they do. Captain Charles Kelly ends up taking control and setting the Marines up in a defensive perimeter. But the Marines there were referencing Custer's Last Stand. That's how bad it was. They were calling this mini Dunkirk or something.
Wow.
Just terrible scenario. Now, another thing adding to problems is the Marines on top of Hill 84 did not have radio comms. And the reason they didn't have radio comms, the radio operator, Sergeant Robert Raysbrook, I guess, everything was so quick when they got the order to launch and so excited that he didn't bring the radio with him.
Oh, no.
So now they're in this terrible situation and they don't have a radio. And they're cut off. They're way behind enemy lines, right? And the Higgins boats dropped them off and left. The Higgins boats went back to Lunga Point. They didn't just stay on the beach.
Yeah.
So they really are over there stranded by themselves in a really terrible scenario. Well, lucky for them, these guys are still fairly new on the island, and they still have their white skivvy shirts. Back then they had white skivvy shirts instead of the green they wear today.
Okay.
The guys that had been there for a while, the 1st Marines and the 5th Marines, the regiments that had been there for a while, they didn't have any skivvies left. They had all rotten off in the jungle. But these guys being new, they still had them. So what they end up doing is they all end up taking off their white shirts and they spell out help on this bald ridge line. There's a wide open field essentially on this mountain. They spell out help with their white T-shirts, really big, and the Cactus Air Force pilot is flying by, supporting this operation taking place at the mouth of the Matanikau, and he sees this. He sees the word "help" spelled with white T-shirts, so he radios back to Edson and to Vandergrift like, "Yo, your guys, I don't know what's happening, but they spelled out help with their white T-shirts. I think you need to get over there to them." Now Edson receives this message. His Raider battalion it fails to cross the Matanikau. They're taking tremendous casualties in the process. And just speaking to those around him, he states, "I guess we better call them off. They can't seem to cross the river," talking about his guys. Well, Chesty Puller hears this and is immediately infuriated, because the majority of his battalion is on the other side of the Matanikau, and they're in a really terrible spot. So he is, I guess, recorded as saying something along the lines of, "You're not going to throw away these men," and getting up, storming out of the COC, the command center, off towards the beach, where he's going to wave down a Navy ship, like a big cruiser or destroyer. It's a destroyer. He waves down a destroyer. They come over, they pick him up. He gets on board. He tells them what's going on, and they sail over towards Point Cruz.
Get him, Chesty.
Well, when it gets there, this stuff, you can't make this stuff up. This is crazy. And if I were to see this in a movie, I'd be like, no freaking way. That's not how. But this is really what's happening.
Wow.
They sail over there, and they get right off the coast of where these Marines are stranded. They still don't have a way to talk to them, though. There's no radio, and they got to send in artillery to get these Japanese troops pushed back so they can clear an exit for them to get to the beach. They can't just. They've been surrounded. They can't just get down there. But Sergeant Robert Raysbrook, to make up for having forgotten the radio, I guess, to begin with, he volunteers himself to go out and amidst this incoming heavy Japanese enemy fire, right? Stand out in the open and do the semaphore flags. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Have you ever seen, on old Navy boats, they'll use the little flags to send codes back and forth to each other? He gets out on top of this bald hill, no cover, exposed to enemy fire, and starts semaphoring the boat. Well, Chesty Puller's an old Marine, right? He's an old breed. Like he's really lived the naval life, sailing all over the place. So he knows semaphore. So Chesty Puller himself is semaphoring back to this guy. Just crazy. It's just crazy.
Wow.
And so they communicate where they're going to shoot their artillery. They're going to pummel this side, and then when it lifts, you guys make a run for the beach. And they do that, right? They start bombarding this area around Hill 84
Impressive.
to relieve pressure on these guys. At that point, Chesty Puller radios back to the Coast Guardmen that are manning the Higgins boats that had taken the 3 companies over there initially, and says, "Hey, I need you guys to come get my Marines off the beach." And this leads us into another pretty fascinating story. It's about a guy named Signalman First Class Douglas Munro, who is a Coast Guardsman. It's a pretty fascinating story, and it's a pretty special story, especially to the guys of the Coast Guard, men and women of the Coast Guard. This is, I would assume, something very similar to like how we feel about John Basilone.
Okay.
I feel like they got to feel this very similar to this about this guy. But Douglas Munro ends up taking, he leads 10 of these 8 Higgins boats and then 2 LVTs, which are basically amphibious tanks.
Okay.
He leads these 10 watercraft back over to the rendezvous to get these guys off the beach. And, as they approach they're being taken under enemy fire. The Marines are down on the beach now, right, and it completely exposed. So they're trying to rush in there and get these guys, back on board and out of danger. A few different times, Douglas Munro is going to put his Higgins boat in between the Marines and the beach as they're coming out to try to get onto these other craft. He's going to line his up as a shield essentially and engage with his mounted machine gun these Japanese positions. And then after things are going on for a little bit, eventually one of these LVTs, these amphibious tanks, gets stuck on a sandbar, and so Munro orders that a few other craft work on getting that thing off the sandbar and freed, able to get back out to sea. And he moved further up to the beach, getting even more in between the Marines and where the enemy fire was coming from, to act as a shield just until this matter could be resolved. And it's, when he does that, eventually he's ended up wounded. He's on the base of the skull and he passes out. Well, eventually they get that LVT dislodged from the sandbar, and everybody starts pulling. They start pulling away from the beach. They've picked up the Marines, and I'm going to interject here. I'm going to interrupt this story just to kind of tell you, what things are looking like as far as the Marine side go. They had 24 at this battle. 24 guys were. They ended up having to leave 18 of them there. So to this day, on Guadalcanal, near the Matanicao River on Hill 84, there are 18 Marines that have never been recovered.
That's the second time actually happening, because the same thing happened at the Getchie Patrol.
Yeah,
they're still there.
Yeah, so it's which would be super that's obviously heartbreaking to have to do that. But again, we live in this era where we're so used to hearing "leave no man behind." There are certain circumstances, unfortunately, when you get into warfare this big and this epic and like this costly, there are times when that is just not feasible.
Right.
And as sad and unfortunate as that is, and I hope we never get to a war where we have that happening, again. But unfortunately, you get into, what's happening in Ukraine right now. I guarantee you there are times when it's just not feasible. You just can't. The cost in life to recover would be far too great to be able to do it. So unfortunately, that's what's happening. But they do get the Marines, the ones that are alive, they do get them back on these Higgins boats and then back out to sea and towards Lunga Point. Now, Douglas Munro is said to have regained consciousness after they got a little ways away from the beach. And it's rumored that with his breath, he asks if they were able to get the Marines off the beach. And they told him, yep. And then he died. And he is the only Coast Guardsman in the history of the United States Coast Guard to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor, still to this day.
How about that? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this clip from America Fog of War, catch the rest of the episode here.